Hello, my name is Regina Whitaker, and my speech is about mental illness, and it's about my brother-in-law, Radiel Hopkins. My thesis statement is that I'm going to persuade my audience that the mentally ill in America are not getting the help they need by first demonstrating that the current public policies are ineffective, second, by explaining how the housing options are inadequate, and finally, by reviewing laws intended to help the mentally ill are in fact hindering their rehabilitation. It can strike at any time, affecting the young and old, rich or poor, educated or illiterate. The symptoms frequently go ignored and untreated for years until a person's behavior becomes disturbing to others or his or her actions result in a personal tragedy. Mental illness is a disease associated with a chemical imbalance in the brain. Some of you may have experienced the frustration of trying to help a friend or family member get help if they are physically ill. Just filling out insurance forms or finding the right healthcare provider is aggravating. But I can attest through my own personal experience that trying to get help for a person such as my brother-in-law, Radel Hopkins, with mental illness, it can be a nightmare. So I'm going to persuade that to you that the mentally ill in America are not getting the help that they need. First, I will demonstrate how the current public policies are ineffective. Second, I will explain how the housing options for the mentally ill are inadequate. And finally, I will review how laws intended to help the mentally ill are in fact hindering their rehabilitation. Number one is the current public policies are ineffective. The process of removing patients from public mental institutions began in the 1960s. In his 1997 book entitled Out of the Shadows, Dr. E. Fuller Torrey states that many long-term public psychiatric hospitals are shut down by the government out of concern that the mentally ill people were being treated inhumanly. Inhumanly. Number two, although follow-up care was provided at local mental health clinics, it was left up to the patient to seek help for him or herself. Mental illness clinics then became overburdened. The clinics could not support the large caseloads. The facilities were designed to help people with their minor psychological problems, and staff was untrained to care for the seriously mentally ill. Funding cuts made getting help more difficult. Paul J. Carling, author of the 1999 book entitled Return to the Community, noted that 2 out of 3 neighborhood mental health clinics were closed during the 80s and 90s due to funding cuts. Now I have demonstrated how the current public policies are ineffective. I will explain how housing options for the mentally ill are inadequate. Housing options for the mentally ill are inadequate. The U.S. Conference of Mayors reported in the year 2000 that public housing intended for use for homeless people did not meet the needs of homeless who are also mentally ill. People who suffer from mental illness are often suspicious of others and feel safer outdoors. Available facilities do not provide access to mental health provider or necessary medications. There are no provisions for home care. Visiting nurse programs available to physically disabled people are not available to people with mental disability. Training and education for families do not exist. Communities do not want to house the mentally ill. The federal task force reported that housing built in rundown areas often expose the mentally ill to crime and illegal drugs. Residents continue to vote down legislation that would allow mental health facilities to operate in their neighborhoods. Let's talk about how the laws intended to help them are making them worse. Laws intended to help the mentally ill are in fact hindering their rehabilitation. Families of mentally ill people cannot help them. In a series of editorials in the Los Angeles Times dated November the 18th through the 22nd, 2001, it was stated that the very same laws that were intended to protect the civil rights of the mentally ill do not allow family members, doctors, or judges to force a paranoid schizophrenic to seek medical attention or take prescribed medication. Many times a parent, fearing out of their own safety, is forced to lock their mentally ill family members out of their own homes. The county jail is oftentimes used as a storehouse for the mentally ill. Often disoriented and hallucinating, they are beaten and taken advantage of by others in prison. They are not given their medications, which continue to downward spiral. 72 hours doesn't make it better. Authors Rael Jean Isaac and Virginia Armat described a typical scenario in their book called Madness in the Streets, written in 1995. Local policies bring a patient into a county hospital. Local police, bring a patient into a county hospital. The patient was picked up for public urination and found to be disillusional and suicidal during police questioning. The psychiatric on duty diagnosed this patient with schizophrenia, and the patient is admitted into the psych ward. According to the law, the patient cannot be held against his will for more than 72 hours. In conclusion, I have tried to persuade you that the mentally ill in America are not getting the help that they need by first explaining how the current public policies are ineffective. Second, by explaining how the housing options for the mentally ill are in fact hindering their rehabilitation. And if someone is sick with high blood pressure or diabetes, they can get help that they need by just asking for it. But if that person is sick with mental illness, their brain doesn't work properly, so seeking help becomes more complicated. I hope that I have persuaded you today that the mentally ill are particularly desperate and a vulnerable group of people, and that we have a moral and ethical responsibility to help alleviate some of their suffering, as in the case of my brother-in-law, Raydell Hopkins.